The sun had barely risen when the Navy SEAL parked his car in the lot, ready to take care of some errands he'd put off during his deployment. It had been a long few months full of intense training and long hours away from home, and now all he wanted was to run a few errands and enjoy some peace. The parking lot at the local shopping center was relatively quiet this morning, with only a handful of cars scattered about. As he parked his vehicle, he made sure to park properly, but it was a tight spot. One of those spots that wasn't exactly made for large cars, but it was the only open space available. He didn't think much of it. He was just glad to be home, running errands like any other person. As he got out of his car, he stretched his arms, feeling the stiffness from months of sitting on planes and cars and in briefings. It felt good to be back in a place where he could just walk around without feeling like he was on constant alert. The Navy SEAL made his way toward the entrance of the store, but before he could get too far, he heard a car honking behind him. He turned around, expecting to see someone trying to back out of the lot. Instead, he saw a car slowly driving toward him, a sleek silver sedan with a couple inside. They were staring at him through the windshield, their faces twisted in an expression he couldn't quite read. The woman in the passenger seat pointed at the parking spot he had just pulled out of, shaking her head, and the man in the driver's seat rolled down his window. The Navy SEAL had been in situations where people were upset, but this felt different. It wasn't just about the parking spot, it was something more personal. He stopped for a second, unsure if he had made some mistake he hadn't noticed. "Hey," the man shouted from the car, leaning out the window. "You can't park like that." The Navy SEAL was confused. "It's just a spot," he said, looking at the car, then back at the couple. "It's not marked for anyone specific." But the couple was already getting out of their car. The man slammed his door and the woman did the same, both of them walking quickly toward him. Their steps were sharp, their faces angry. The Navy SEAL could tell that whatever was happening, it wasn't just about parking. He wasn't sure what, but he could feel it. The energy was off and they were clearly upset. "You took our spot," the woman said, her voice rising. There were plenty of other spots. The Navy SEAL had been in tense situations before, but he wasn't used to this kind of energy, aggressive without any real reason. He glanced around, noticing that there were several empty spaces scattered around the lot. This wasn't a big deal. He wasn't taking anyone's spot on purpose. He wanted to de-escalate it, but he didn't know how. "I'm sorry," he said, holding up his hands in a non-confrontational gesture. "There's no sign for this spot. I just needed to park." The man was already walking toward him, his chest puffed out in a way that suggested he wasn't looking for an explanation. The Navy SEAL could feel the anger radiating from both of them, as though they had already made up their minds about who he was and what he was doing. He didn't have time to wonder why they were being so aggressive. It was clear that they weren't interested in hearing him out. The woman stepped closer, arms crossed. "I don't care about your excuse," she snapped. "This was our spot. You're lucky we don't call the cops on you for being a jerk." The Navy SEAL took a deep breath, trying to keep his calm. He knew that reacting the way they wanted would only make the situation worse. But he couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't just about parking. They were angry for reasons that went beyond the car. And now he was in the middle of it, being targeted by two strangers who seemed to want to escalate things. "Look," he said, standing his ground. "I didn't know you were waiting for this spot. It's not marked. I'm not trying to take anything from you." The man took another step toward him, and now the Navy SEAL could feel the tension crackling in the air. "We saw you park here," the man said, "and now you're trying to act all innocent? I'm not buying it." The Navy SEAL's mind began to work through the situation. He could tell these weren't just angry people. They were judgmental too, probably ready to make assumptions about him based on his appearance. He had been in situations where people judged him before, just because of what he wore or how he looked. And the truth was, he didn't have time for this. He wasn't interested in getting into an argument with strangers over a parking spot, especially not after the intense months he had just gone through. "Maybe we can both just go back to our cars," he suggested, trying to avoid things escalating any further, but the woman wasn't having it. "No," she said firmly, stepping closer, her voice sharp. "You think you can just take whatever you want because you're in a uniform? You don't own this place. You need to learn some respect." It felt like a slap in the face, the accusation that he was somehow entitled just because of his uniform. He had worked hard for everything he had, but the judgment was so thick that it was hard to ignore. The couple's attitudes were making him angry now. Not just because of the parking spot, but because of the way they were treating him. He didn't even know them, yet they were assuming so much about him. Their words were like daggers, pointed and cruel. "I'm not trying to cause any problems," he said, trying to remain calm. "I just want to get on with my day." But the woman wasn't done. "You think we care about your day? You think that gives you the right to take our spot and make a mess of things?" The Navy SEAL's patience was wearing thin, but he kept his composure. He didn't want to make the situation worse than it already was. Still, as he looked at the couple, something inside of him began to shift. They were so quick to judge him, so quick to make assumptions about his life. And in that moment, he couldn't help but wonder how many times he'd experienced the same thing. How many times people had judged him before knowing anything about who he was or what he had been through. Before he could respond, the man took a step forward, shoving the Navy SEAL's shoulder in a clear sign of aggression. The woman stepped back, arms still crossed, watching closely. The Navy SEAL, now fed up but trying to control the situation, took a step back, ready to walk away. But the couple wasn't backing down. "You can't just walk away from this," the man yelled. "You owe us an apology." He took another step, now blocking the Navy SEAL from leaving the parking lot. The Navy SEAL didn't want to get into a fight over something this trivial, but the couple wasn't letting up. Their insults grew louder, their words more aggressive, and the situation was becoming harder to control. He knew he had to make a decision, let it go and walk away, or stand his ground. He glanced at the couple one last time, realizing that sometimes, no matter how much you want peace, people will force you into a situation where you have to decide, will you react or will you rise above it? The Navy SEAL stood still, his eyes locked on the couple. He could feel the rising tension in the air. The situation was no longer about a parking spot. It had escalated into something personal. The woman was glaring at him, arms still crossed, her stance rigid with anger. The man who had been walking closer and shoving him just moments ago was now standing right in front of him, almost daring him to respond. For a brief moment, the Navy SEAL thought about walking away. It would have been so easy. Just turn around, walk back to his car, and leave the confrontation behind. But he knew that wasn't the solution. The couple wasn't just angry about a parking spot. They were making assumptions about him, about who he was based on nothing more than the uniform he wore and the color of his skin. He couldn't just walk away without saying something. He had been through too much, and he wasn't going to let anyone disrespect him, especially for something so trivial. "Look," the Navy SEAL said, his voice calm but firm. "I'm not looking for trouble. I just want to park, run my errands, and get on with my day. This isn't worth all the noise." The man narrowed his eyes, clearly not satisfied with the Navy SEAL's response. "You think just because you wear that uniform you can do whatever you want?" He spat, his tone dripping with contempt. "You think you're better than everyone else?" The Navy SEAL took a deep breath, feeling the heat of the situation settle into his chest. He had dealt with this before, the judgment, the assumptions. People who saw the uniform and thought they knew who he was. People who thought they could pick a fight with him because they didn't like what they assumed he represented. But this wasn't a battle worth fighting. Not today. "No," he said slowly, choosing his words carefully. "I don't think I'm better than anyone, but I do think people deserve respect. That's all I'm asking for." The woman snorted in disbelief, shaking her head. "Respect? From you?" she said, her voice mocking. "You don't deserve respect. You're just a guy parking wherever you want, causing trouble for no reason." It was as if she wasn't even listening to him, as if her mind was made up about who he was. The Navy SEAL's patience was thinning. He could feel the anger building inside of him, but he fought it back. His training had taught him how to control his emotions, how to keep calm in the most intense situations. He had faced far greater challenges than this, and yet here he was, standing in a parking lot, arguing with a couple who couldn't see past their own narrow views. He looked at them both, his eyes steady, refusing to show any signs of weakness. "I didn't mean to cause any problems," he said. "But you've made this bigger than it needs to be. I'm just trying to go about my day like anyone else." The man seemed to think about this for a moment, his anger not dissipating but shifting, almost like he was looking for an excuse to escalate things further. "You don't belong here," he muttered, more to himself than to the Navy SEAL. "People like you always think they can get away with everything." The words hit harder than the Navy SEAL was prepared for. He stood there for a moment, stunned by the sheer ignorance and hatred in the man's voice. It wasn't just about the parking spot anymore. It was about race, about assumptions, about the way people saw him and others like him. And that was something he wasn't going to ignore. He had been in far more dangerous situations, but this was different. This wasn't a confrontation he had signed up for. This was pure judgment based on nothing but the color of his skin. "I'm not here to fight with you," the Navy SEAL said, trying to remain calm. "But I won't stand here and let you talk to me like that." "Not today," the woman scoffed, stepping closer to him now, her voice rising with each word. "What are you going to do? You think you can intimidate us with your little uniform and your attitude?" For a moment, the Navy SEAL didn't answer. He wasn't interested in intimidation. He wasn't interested in a fight. But he knew he couldn't just let the words go unchallenged. "No," he said firmly, "I don't think I can intimidate you. But I do think you need to realize that you don't have the right to treat anyone like this. Not me, not anyone." The couple exchanged looks, their expressions filled with disbelief and anger. They were so caught up in their assumptions that they couldn't see the truth standing right in front of them. The Navy SEAL wasn't interested in proving anything to them. He wasn't trying to impress anyone. He was just trying to get through his day, but these people wouldn't let him. "You don't know anything about me," the man said through gritted teeth. "You don't know what it's like for people like us dealing with people like you all the time." It was like a slap in the face. The Navy SEAL's mind raced as he processed the words. What did the man mean by people like us? It wasn't just a simple parking dispute anymore. It was a personal attack, rooted in something deeper than just race. The couple was looking at him as if he was the enemy, as if he was the one who was out of line. And that, above all else, was what hurt the most. The assumption that because of his uniform, because of who they thought he was, he deserved their scorn. "I've dealt with a lot worse than this," the Navy SEAL said quietly, his voice calm but carrying weight. "I've been in situations where I've had to fight for my life. But this is just ignorance, and I'm not going to waste any more of my time on it." He turned away from them, heading toward the store. The couple watched him walk, still yelling insults, still calling him names. But the Navy SEAL didn't flinch. He knew he couldn't change their minds. He knew that their view of him, their judgment, had nothing to do with who he was and everything to do with how they saw the world. But he wasn't going to let that affect him. Inside the store, he went about his errands, trying to shake off the encounter. He wasn't going to let it ruin his day. But it wasn't easy. The words they'd thrown at him, the judgment, the anger, it all weighed heavily on him. It was something he had dealt with before, but that didn't make it any easier. And now he was starting to wonder, how many times would he have to deal with this kind of thing? How many times would people look at him and make assumptions without ever taking the time to get to know him? The Navy SEAL finished his shopping quickly, eager to leave the store and put the encounter behind him. But as he walked back to his car, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The couple's words were still echoing in his head, and no matter how hard he tried to block them out, they stuck. It was hard to ignore the way people judged him without knowing anything about him. It was hard to ignore the hate that simmered just below the surface of their words. When he reached his car, he paused for a moment, looking back at the lot. The couple's car was still parked, and they were still standing near it, arguing with someone else now. He didn't feel the need to engage again. He had said what he needed to say. He had made it clear that he wasn't going to let them walk all over him, but he didn't need to keep fighting. Sometimes walking away was the best option. He got in his car, started the engine, and drove away, hoping that the rest of his day would be less complicated than this encounter had been. But even as he drove, the weight of it all still sat on his chest. The anger of the couple, their assumptions, their insults, they lingered, leaving a mark that he couldn't easily shake. The Navy SEAL's drive home was quiet. The events from earlier that day replayed in his mind, each time with a bit more clarity. He tried to push the memory aside, focusing on the road, but it was hard. The words from the couple, the insults, the assumptions, stuck with him. They weren't just angry about a parking spot. It wasn't about the small misunderstanding. It was deeper than that. It was about prejudice, about judgment, and about the way people saw him without knowing a thing about who he really was. It wasn't the first time he had experienced something like this, but that didn't make it any easier. Every time it happened, it felt like a small wound, and after enough wounds, they began to sting a little more each time. He had been trained to endure far more intense physical and mental stress, yet this was different. It was personal. He shook his head as he made the turn toward his apartment. There was no use in dwelling on it. He had enough to focus on, enough things to be grateful for, and the petty insults of a couple weren't going to change that. The last thing he needed was to let them steal his peace of mind. When he arrived at his apartment, he parked his car and stepped out, taking in a deep breath of fresh air. It was early evening, and the weather was cool and calm. The city around him hummed with life, the sounds of people going about their daily routines filling the air. He liked living here in this neighborhood. It was quiet, peaceful, and far from the chaos of the military life he had known for so long. This was his time to unwind, to focus on things that mattered to him, like family, friends, and his personal growth. He wasn't about to let some strangers ruin that. He headed inside and started preparing a simple meal. Nothing fancy, just something easy to make. As he stood in the kitchen chopping vegetables, his thoughts drifted back to the couple. He wondered what had caused them to act the way they did. What made them so angry? Why did they feel the need to lash out at him, a complete stranger, over something so insignificant? He had a feeling it wasn't just the parking spot. It was deeper. He had seen it before. The way people made assumptions about him just because of the uniform he wore, the color of his skin, and the job he did. It didn't matter how much he had sacrificed, how hard he worked, or how much he had given to his country. To some people, he would always be just another stereotype. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was that they didn't even give him a chance to explain himself. They didn't want to know who he really was. They didn't care. They had already made up their minds. The Navy SEAL finished cooking and sat down at the table, taking a moment to appreciate the simple meal. It wasn't the food that mattered. It was the peace that came with it. He was grateful for moments like this, for the time to sit down and enjoy something without the weight of the world on his shoulders. The stress from the earlier encounter began to melt away as he focused on the meal in front of him, letting the quiet of the evening seep into his bones. After eating, he sat back, letting his mind wander. It wasn't long before he thought of the couple again. He didn't like to dwell on things, but there was something about their behavior that unsettled him. He had seen that kind of judgment before, but this time it had stung a little more. It wasn't just their anger. It was their complete unwillingness to listen, to understand, or to even consider that maybe, just maybe, they were wrong. And that's when it hit him. They weren't just angry at him for parking in a spot. They were angry at everything that he represented. They had assumed things about him that had nothing to do with who he was. They had seen the uniform, the color of his skin, and made a judgment that wasn't based on facts but on stereotypes. And that was the problem. People like them were quick to judge, to label, to make assumptions. But what if, instead of judging people, we tried to understand them? What if we gave people the benefit of the doubt instead of assuming the worst? The Navy SEAL thought about this for a while. He realized that he couldn't change the way people thought. He couldn't control how others saw him or how they judged him. But he could control how he reacted. He could choose not to let their judgment affect him. He could choose to rise above it. And that's what he did. He realized that he wasn't going to waste his time or energy on people who couldn't see beyond their own biases. He had more important things to focus on: his own peace, his own happiness. He wasn't going to let the ignorance of others define him. He wasn't going to let their assumptions cloud his mind. The next few days passed without incident. The Navy SEAL went about his routine, focusing on work and personal projects. He found that the more he focused on his own growth, the less he was bothered by the negativity of others. He spent time with friends, caught up on his favorite books, and worked on getting back into show. Slowly, the sting from the confrontation faded, replaced by a sense of clarity and peace. One evening, after a long day of work and exercise, the Navy SEAL decided to take a walk through the park near his apartment. It was one of his favorite places to clear his mind, a quiet spot where he could reflect and let go of any lingering stress. He had been coming to this park for years, ever since he moved to the city, and each visit brought him a sense of calm. As he walked along the path, the sounds of nature, the rustling leaves, the chirping birds, surrounded him, easing the tension in his shoulders. He had been on countless missions around the world, facing danger and uncertainty, but this was different. This was his time to recharge, to be with his own thoughts. While walking, he saw a group of people gathered near a bench, laughing and chatting. The sight made him smile. There was something comforting about seeing people enjoying life, free from the burdens that sometimes weighed so heavily on others. He appreciated these small moments, the simple joys of being alive. As he walked further, he noticed a man sitting alone on a bench by the lake, staring out at the water. He looked deep in thought, distant. The Navy SEAL had always been someone who noticed people. He couldn't help it. There was something about the way this man sat, his body language so tense, that made the Navy SEAL pause. He debated whether or not to approach the man. There was no real reason to, no obligation. But there was something about him that drew the Navy SEAL in. Maybe it was the way the man seemed lost, the same way he had felt after his encounter with the couple. Or maybe it was just the Navy SEAL's nature to help others when he could. After a moment's hesitation, he walked over to the bench and sat down next to the man. He didn't speak at first, just sat quietly, letting the sound of the water fill the silence between them. Finally, the man looked over, surprised to see someone sitting next to him. The Navy SEAL offered a small smile and the man returned it, though it was clear he wasn't completely at ease. "Hey," the Navy SEAL said gently. "Mind if I sit here?" The man nodded, not saying much at first, but he seemed to relax a little. They sat in silence for a moment, both staring at the water. Finally, the man spoke. "I've been struggling with a lot lately," he said, his voice low. "I feel like I'm stuck, like I'm not moving forward, just going in circles." The Navy SEAL nodded, understanding. He had felt that way many times before, like everything was just out of his control, like nothing was going right. But in that moment, he knew that sometimes the best thing to do was listen, to let someone else speak, to let them release the weight they were carrying. "You don't have to have it all figured out," the Navy SEAL said after a long pause. "Life's not about having a clear path all the time. It's about taking it one step at a time, doing the best you can with what you have." The man looked over at him, his expression softening. "Yeah," he said, nodding slowly. "Maybe you're right." For a moment they sat there together, two strangers on a bench by the water, both carrying their own burdens. The Navy SEAL didn't have all the answers. But in that moment, sharing a moment of quiet understanding, he realized that sometimes just being there for someone was enough. And maybe, just maybe, he had helped the man see that it was okay to not have all the answers, because none of us really do. The days following the encounter with the couple felt different for the Navy SEAL. There was a certain peace he hadn't experienced in a while. It wasn't because the confrontation had been resolved. It was because he had chosen not to let it continue weighing on him. For the first time in a long time, he felt lighter, free of the emotional baggage that had followed him for far too long. After that evening in the park, where he had met the man sitting by the lake, things had started to shift. The man, who had seemed so distant and lost in thought, had reminded the Navy SEAL of something important. He had reminded him that sometimes it wasn't about finding the right answers or fixing everything. It was about being present, about understanding that everyone was carrying their own weight, and that some battles weren't meant to be fought at all. They were simply part of the journey. The Navy SEAL found himself walking more in the mornings, reflecting on the lessons he had learned from the people he met along the way. The quiet moments were becoming more meaningful, and he realized that the world didn't need him to be perfect. It didn't need him to fix everything that went wrong. It simply needed him to be kind, to show up, and to keep going, even when things got tough. On the weekends, he would volunteer at a local community center. It wasn't anything grand, just helping out with food drives, assisting in classes for children, or even talking with people who came in needing someone to listen. It was a small way to give back, to use the lessons he had learned through his experiences to make a difference in the lives of others. He had always believed in serving others, and though the work was different now, it still felt right. It gave him purpose. One Saturday morning, after spending a few hours at the center, the Navy SEAL decided to stop by the coffee shop on his way home. It had become a little ritual. He'd order his coffee, sit by the window, and watch the world go by. Sometimes he'd strike up a conversation with someone, sometimes he'd just sit in silence, appreciating the moment of calm. That morning, as he sat sipping his coffee, he noticed a couple across the room, They were sitting near the window much like he was and seemed deep in conversation. The man was laughing, his voice light, while the woman listened intently. There was an ease to their interaction, a sense of warmth that was hard to miss. For some reason, the Navy SEAL felt drawn to them. It wasn't that they were anything particularly remarkable, but there was something about the way they connected that caught his attention. He could see that the woman was smiling, genuinely, enjoying the conversation, and the man's laughter was full of lightness without a care in the world. It made him think back to the couple he had encountered in the parking lot, the way they had been filled with judgment, anger, and assumptions. How different things could have been if they had chosen to engage with kindness instead of hostility. He wondered if they ever took the time to listen to others, to truly understand people before jumping to conclusions. The Navy SEAL couldn't help but reflect on his own experiences. How many times he had made assumptions. How many times he had been too quick to judge others. He had been trained to be observant, to assess situations quickly, but he had also learned that not everything could be judged by its surface. There were depths to people that took time to uncover, and rushing to conclusions often led to misunderstandings. As he sat there, deep in thought, the couple finished their conversation and stood to leave. The man turned to the woman with a smile, and they walked out of the coffee shop together, hand in hand. The Navy SEAL watched them go, feeling a sense of peace settle over him. There was something about their connection, something about the way they moved through the world together that felt right. He thought about the people in his life, the friends, the family, the colleagues, and how they had shaped him into who he was today. He realized that everyone had their own battles to fight, their own struggles to face. Some people fought battles that were visible to the world, while others fought silent wars within themselves. And sometimes, all it took was a little kindness to help someone through their hardest moments. The Navy SEAL finished his coffee and left the shop, his mind still on the couple. He realized that, in a way, their relationship had been a reminder that kindness, understanding, and patience were just as important as strength and courage. That sometimes the best way to handle a difficult situation wasn't by fighting back, but by walking away and choosing peace. It was a lesson he had learned time and time again throughout his life, but it felt different this time. This time, it felt like something he truly understood. It wasn't just about confronting people when they were wrong. It was about knowing when to let go, when to move on, and when to rise above the noise. As he walked through his neighborhood that afternoon, the world around him seemed brighter. People smiled at him as he passed by, and he found himself smiling back without thinking. It was amazing how a simple shift in mindset could change everything. The anger and frustration he had felt just days ago were now replaced with a calm, unshakable peace. The Navy SEAL spent the rest of the day focusing on the things that mattered most to him: his health, his relationships, his personal growth. He spent time with friends, enjoyed a good meal, and reflected on the lessons he had learned from the people he met along the way. He knew that he couldn't change the world, but he could change how he reacted to it. He could choose to be kind, to show patience, and to spread peace wherever he went. Later that evening, as he sat on his balcony watching the sunset, he thought about the couple from the parking lot again. He had no idea what their lives were like or what had led them to behave the way they did. Maybe they had been having a bad day. Maybe they were dealing with something that made them lash out. But one thing was clear: he wasn't going to let their judgment define him. He knew that he had a choice. He could hold on to the anger, the hurt, and the frustration, or he could let it go and choose peace. He could spend his time dwelling on the negativity, or he could focus on the good things in his life, and in that mom. And he chose peace. The Navy SEAL leaned back in his chair, feeling the cool breeze on his face, and let out a deep sigh of contentment. The world around him was full of noise, full of people who were quick to judge and quick to anger. But in the midst of it all, there was also beauty. There was kindness, there was love, and there was the quiet, steady rhythm of life moving forward. He didn't need to understand everything. He didn't need to have all the answers. All he needed was to keep moving forward, to keep showing up and to keep choosing peace, no matter what came his way, And as he watched the sun dip below the horizon, the Navy SEAL knew that he was exactly where he needed to be. At peace with himself, at peace with the world, and ready to face whatever came next. A few days had passed since the Navy SEAL had made the decision to let go of the anger and frustration that had followed him from the parking lot encounter. His life had settled into a new rhythm. The peace he had found felt more lasting than he expected. Even though there had been a few small challenges here and there, he knew he had control over his reaction to them. That was something he hadn't fully realized before. The morning started the same way, with a quiet cup of coffee as he looked out the window, the city gradually waking up beneath him. It was peaceful, and for the first time in a long time he felt a sense of clarity. His mind no longer felt like it was constantly on guard, waiting for the next problem to arise. Instead, it was calm, still, and open to whatever the day would bring. One evening, after a long day of work, the Navy SEAL decided to take a walk around his neighborhood. He often walked in the evenings to clear his mind, to relax after the intensity of his daily routine. It was a chance for him to reflect and think about the things that truly mattered. As he walked down the familiar streets, he noticed something he hadn't seen in a while, a small group of children playing in the park. They were running around, laughing and enjoying their time together, without a care in the world. The simple joy on their faces reminded him of a time before he had to worry about the stresses of adulthood, before he had to carry the weight of responsibility on his shoulders. He couldn't help but smile as he watched them play. It was amazing how children could experience so much joy in the simplest moments. It made him wonder when people lost that sense of pure happiness, that ability to be carefree and in the moment. When did people start to carry the weight of the world with them, allowing it to overshadow the little joys that came from everyday life? As he continued walking, he found himself near the local coffee shop again. He had passed by it many times, but something about it felt different that day. He didn't know why, but he felt a sudden urge to stop. He stepped inside, ordering his usual coffee, and found a quiet spot by the window. As he settled into his chair, he let out a deep breath, feeling the stress of the day melt away. He didn't realize how much he had missed this moment of stillness, just sitting with a warm drink and watching the world go by. It reminded him of the times when he was deployed and how precious moments like these were. Back then, every quiet moment was a gift, something to be cherished in the midst of the chaos. As he sipped his coffee, the Navy SEAL's mind wandered again. He thought about the couple from the parking lot and how they had treated him that day. He had spent a lot of time reflecting on that encounter, but in the end he realized that it was just one small chapter in a much bigger story. He couldn't let that brief moment define him, nor could he allow their actions to dictate how he saw the world. It was easy to hold on to resentment, to let that one negative experience color his view of everything that came after it. But he had learned that letting go was the key to finding peace. He had to forgive not just the couple but himself too. Holding on to anger only dragged him down, and he wasn't going to let that happen. Life was too short to carry that kind of weight. The Navy SEAL's thoughts were interrupted by a voice from behind him. "Mind if I join you?" He turned around to see an older man standing there, holding a coffee cup in his hand. The man was dressed casually, but there was something about him that made him seem approachable. The Navy SEAL nodded, motioning to the empty chair across from him. The man sat down, offering a friendly smile. "It's a nice evening, isn't it?" "Yes, it is," the Navy SEAL replied, returning the smile. He hadn't expected to strike up a conversation, but there was something about the man's presence that made him feel at ease. For a few moments they sat in silence, both enjoying their coffee. The Navy SEAL was content just being in the moment, not feeling the need to fill the air with words. It was nice to sit with someone and not have to explain anything, just to share space and time. Finally, the man spoke. "You look like you've got something on your mind. I hope I'm not interrupting." The Navy SEAL hesitated, but something about the man's genuine interest made him feel comfortable. He had learned over the years that talking about what was on his mind often helped him process things. So without thinking too much about it, he decided to share. "It's been a weird few days," the Navy SEAL began. "I had a run-in with a couple a few days ago, and they really got under my skin. I didn't expect it, but it's been hard to shake off." The older man listened intently, nodding. "People can be strange sometimes," he said. "We all have our battles, and sometimes that battle spills over into how we treat others." The Navy SEAL raised an eyebrow, surprised by the man's insight. "You think so?" The man chuckled softly. Oh, absolutely. We all carry things with us, things people might never see. And sometimes when people are upset or frustrated, they lash out at others. Not because of who you are, but because of something they're dealing with. The Navy SEAL thought about this for a moment. It made sense. He had been so focused on how the couple had treated him that he hadn't considered what might have been going on in their lives. He didn't know their story, didn't know what struggles they might have been facing. And maybe that's why they reacted the way they did, because they were fighting their own battles. That's a good point, the Navy SEAL said, nodding thoughtfully. I hadn't really considered it like that. The older man smiled warmly. It's easy to get caught up in how people treat us, especially when it feels unfair. But the truth is, we never really know what's going on in someone else's life. All we can control is how we respond. The Navy SEAL sat back in his chair, absorbing the man's words. He had heard similar things before, but something about the way this stranger said it made it click. He realized that he had been holding on to anger, thinking that if he didn't confront the couple, he was letting them win. But in reality, the only person he was hurting was himself. You know, the man continued, life is too short to waste time holding on to grudges. You can't change how other people act, but you can change how you respond. And in the end, that's what matters. The Navy SEAL felt a weight lift off his shoulders as the man spoke. He had already made the decision to move on, but hearing those words from someone else gave him the clarity he needed. It wasn't about winning or losing a confrontation. It was about finding peace within himself no matter what others did or said. Thanks, the Navy SEAL said, his voice steady. I needed to hear that. The older man gave him a reassuring nod. No problem. Sometimes, all we need is a reminder that we're in control of our own peace. They sat in silence for a while longer, both sipping their coffee and watching the world outside. The Navy SEAL felt a sense of calm settle over him. It wasn't the first time he had heard advice like this, but it felt different now. He was ready to let go of the past, ready to move forward with a new perspective. Eventually, the man stood up to leave. Take care of yourself, he said with a smile. And remember, peace is something you create, not something you wait for. Will do, the Navy SEAL replied, feeling lighter than he had in days. As the man walked out of the coffee shop, the Navy SEAL sat back in his chair, reflecting on the conversation. For the first time in a long time, he felt at peace with himself. He wasn't going to let the actions of others define him. He was going to focus on what he could control, his own response, his own peace. The world was full of challenges, full of moments that tested his patience and his strength. But in the end, it was up to him to decide how to navigate those challenges. And he was ready. He was ready to face whatever came next, knowing that peace came from within. As he finished his coffee and stood up to leave, the Navy SEAL smiled to himself. It had been a good day, and for the first time in a while, he felt truly at peace. The days after the conversation at the coffee shop felt like a turning point for the Navy SEAL. He had learned a lot in the past few weeks, not just about others, but about himself. He had always been someone who prided himself on his ability to stay focused, to keep his mind sharp, and to always be ready for whatever life threw his way. But this was different. He had come to realize that sometimes the toughest battles weren't fought with strength or strategy. They were fought with patience, understanding, and the ability to let go. He had spent the past few years navigating a life filled with tension, expectation, and the constant pressure to succeed. In the military, he had been trained to respond quickly, to make split-second decisions, and to be ready for any challenge. But the civilian world, his current world, was different. People didn't always expect immediate answers, and things didn't always move at the pace he was used to. There were moments of stillness, moments of quiet that he hadn't known how to handle. It was in those moments that he realized he needed to learn how to let go, to embrace the quiet and the calm rather than constantly seek out the next challenge. One evening, after a full day of errands and work, the Navy SEAL found himself walking through the same park he had visited a few weeks earlier. It was a place he had grown fond of, peaceful with the gentle sounds of nature in the background. It wasn't far from his apartment, and it had become a place for him to clear his mind. He walked along the path, letting his thoughts drift. As he walked, he noticed how different the park felt now. The leaves on the trees had started to change colors, the bright green of summer giving way to the warm oranges and yellows of autumn. The air had a crispness to it, and the smell of the earth was more noticeable than usual. He couldn't help but feel a sense of contentment as he walked, the beauty of the changing season reminding him of how things in life could be cyclical, always evolving and growing. As he passed by the small playground, he saw the same group of children from his last visit, running and laughing. This time they were playing a game of tag. He smiled as he watched them, feeling the joy of their innocence and the freedom that came with being young. He thought back to his own childhood, how simple things had once seemed, how carefree everything had felt. But life, as he had learned, wasn't always so simple. It could be messy, complicated, and sometimes it was hard to see the beauty through the chaos. The Navy SEAL slowed his pace, reflecting on how far he had come. A few months ago, he had been dealing with a world full of judgment, assumptions, and prejudice. The encounter with the couple had shaken him, but it had also forced him to look inward and ask himself some difficult questions. Who was he really? What did he want his life to look like? And most importantly, how could he find peace in a world that often seemed so full of noise? He had come to realize that peace wasn't something he could just wait for. It wasn't something that would magically appear when things finally settled down. It was something he had to create within himself, even in the midst of the chaos. He couldn't control how others acted, but he could control how he responded. That was a lesson he had learned time and time again, and it was one he was still learning to master. As he continued his walk, the Navy SEAL passed by a bench near the edge of the park. He noticed an older man sitting there alone watching the children play. There was something about the man that caught his attention. His posture was relaxed, but there was a quiet strength in the way he sat. The Navy SEAL recognized that look. It was the look of someone who had lived through many battles, both physical and emotional, and had learned how to find peace in the midst of it all. The man's eyes met his, and he smiled, motioning for the Navy SEAL to join him. Without thinking, the Navy SEAL walked over and sat down next to him. There was something about the man that made him feel comfortable, a kindred spirit of sorts. The older man nodded in acknowledgement. "You seem like someone who's carrying a lot on your shoulders," he said, his voice soft but wise. The Navy SEAL looked at the man, surprised by his perceptiveness. He hadn't said anything about his struggles, but it seemed like the man could see right through him. "Yeah," the Navy SEAL said, his voice steady. "It's been a rough few months, but I'm getting there." The man smiled knowingly. "We all have our moments. Sometimes it feels like we're weighed down by everything, but the truth is we don't have to carry it all at once." The Navy SEAL thought about this for a moment. It wasn't the first time he had heard that advice, but it felt different coming from this man. There was something in his eyes, something that spoke of a life well lived, of wisdom earned through experience. It was clear that the man had been through his own struggles, but had come out the other side stronger, more at peace. "I've been trying to figure out how to let go," the Navy SEAL said quietly. "I've spent so much of my life holding on to things, fighting battles, trying to prove myself. But it's like I can't find the peace I'm looking for." The older man chuckled softly. "Peace isn't something you find out there," he said, gesturing to the park. "It's something you create inside yourself. It's about choosing how you respond, how you view the world around you." The Navy SEAL nodded slowly, letting the man's words sink in. "I think I've been focused on the wrong things. I've been trying to control everything, trying to fix everything. But I realize now that some things aren't meant to be fixed. They're meant to be accepted." The older man's eyes twinkled. "Exactly. You can't control everything. Life has its ups and downs, and sometimes the best thing you can do is let it flow. Take each day as it comes. Find the beauty in the small moments. That's where peace is found." For a few moments they sat in silence, watching the children play. The sun was beginning to set, casting a warm glow over the park. It was a peaceful scene, one that reminded the Navy SEAL of the simple beauty of life. In that moment he felt a sense of calm wash over him, as if the world had slowed down just for a second, allowing him to breathe. After a while, the older man stood up, his joints creaking as he stretched. "It's time for me to go," he said, turning to the Navy SEAL. "But remember what I said. Peace is something you create within yourself. Don't wait for it to come to you. You have the power to choose how you respond." The Navy SEAL watched as the man walked away, feeling a deep sense of gratitude. He didn't know the man's story, but he had just received a lesson that would stay with him forever. He realized that the key to peace wasn't in the world around him, but within himself. He had the power to choose how he responded to the challenges that came his way. and that choice would determine his peace. As the evening faded into night, the Navy SEAL continued his walk, his mind clearer than it had been in a long time. The world was still full of challenges, but now he knew that he could face them with a new perspective. He didn't have to fight every battle. He didn't have to prove anything. He just needed to be present, to accept the things he couldn't change, and to create peace where he could. And as he walked home, he felt a sense of gratitude for the wisdom he had gained. He wasn't perfect. He would still face challenges. But he was learning how to let go, how to choose peace, and how to embrace the beauty of the present moment. The Navy SEAL woke up the next morning feeling a little different, as though something inside him had shifted overnight. The night before had been filled with deep reflection. He had spent hours thinking about the conversation with the older man at the park and the lessons he had learned in the past weeks. There was a sense of peace that had been settling into his life, and it felt right, like something he had been searching for without even realizing it. The weight he had carried for so long from past mistakes, frustrations, and misunderstandings was slowly lifting. He still had a long way to go, but for the first time in a while, he felt like he was heading in the right direction. The morning sunlight streamed through the window, casting soft golden hues across his small apartment. He rose, stretching his arms above his head and taking a deep breath, enjoying the simplicity of the moment. It was one of those rare mornings when nothing felt rushed. He wasn't caught up in the frenzy of work or worrying about what lay ahead. He felt like he had a moment to just exist, to enjoy the quiet that surrounded him. He made himself a cup of coffee and sat down at the kitchen table, allowing himself to savor the first sip as he looked out at the world outside. The streets were still quiet, and he could hear the faint sounds of birds chirping in the distance. It was one of those mornings where he could just be, without any need to prove himself to anyone, without any expectations weighing on his shoulders. Over the last few weeks, he had learned a lot about letting go of things that didn't serve him. His military training had always emphasized control, discipline, and preparation. But in the civilian world, he had discovered that sometimes the most important thing was to simply release the need to control everything. It wasn't always easy, but he was beginning to understand that true strength didn't always come from holding on. It often came from letting go. The Navy SEAL finished his coffee and decided to take a walk to clear his mind. It had become a sort of ritual for him, walking through the neighborhood, allowing his thoughts to wander and seeing the world around him in a different light. This morning he noticed things he hadn't before. The way the leaves had started to fall from the trees, how the breeze was cooler than usual, and the soft sounds of people waking up and starting their day. It all seemed so simple, yet it felt profoundly beautiful in its simplicity. As he walked, he passed by a small bookstore that he frequented from time to time. He had always been an avid reader, and there was something comforting about the smell of old books, the quiet stillness of the store. On a whim, he decided to step inside. The bell above the door jingled as he entered, and the shopkeeper gave him a friendly nod. The Navy SEAL wandered through the aisles, running his fingers along the spines of the books. He had always been drawn to stories of triumph, of struggle, of hope. He picked up a novel, its cover worn from years of being read, and flipped through the pages. There was something about immersing himself in the world of fiction that allowed him to escape from his own reality, even for just a little while. After a few minutes of browsing, he spotted a book that caught his attention. It was a collection of short stories, each one exploring themes of human connection, love, and loss. He had always been intrigued by stories about people who overcame challenges, stories that showed how resilience and kindness could change the course of someone's life. Without a second thought, he took the book to the counter and purchased it. Walking out of the bookstore, he felt a sense of calm wash over him. There was something about the act of buying a book, of choosing a story that he knew would teach him something new, that felt grounding. It was a small, simple act, but it reminded him of the importance of nurturing his mind, of continuing to learn and grow even when things seemed still. As he walked back home, his thoughts drifted to the couple from the parking lot. The memory of that confrontation still lingered in the back of his mind, but he had learned to see it differently now. He understood that they had acted out of their own frustrations, their own insecurities. It wasn't about him, and it wasn't about the parking spot. It was about their inability to see beyond their own narrow view of the world. The Navy SEAL had realized that he couldn't change the way people saw him. He couldn't control their judgments or their assumptions. but he could control how he responded. He could choose to let their words and actions roll off him, to refuse to let them define who he was. It wasn't always easy, but every day he was getting better at it. He was learning to find his own peace regardless of what others did. That afternoon, he sat down on the couch with the new book and began to read. The stories were exactly what he needed, each one a small reminder of the power of human connection, of the ways in which people could change each other's lives, often without even realizing it. It was easy to forget the impact small gestures could have on the people around you, especially when life felt overwhelming. But as he read, he was reminded that the smallest acts of kindness could be the ones that made the biggest difference. Hours passed before he finished the first story. It was about a man who had gone through a deep personal loss but found a way to heal by reaching out to others, offering his time and support to people who were struggling. The story resonated with him deeply. It reminded him of his own journey, the struggles he had faced, the battles he had fought, and how in the end, it was the connections he had made along the way that had truly healed him. When he finished the book later that evening, he felt a sense of gratitude. It wasn't just for the lessons the stories had imparted, but for the simple act of taking time for himself. In the past, he had been so consumed with everything else, the missions, the training, the pressure, that he had neglected these moments of self-care. But now he understood how important they were. They allowed him to recharge, to reconnect with himself, and to continue growing. The next few days were filled with more moments of reflection. He continued his walks, spent time with friends, and dove deeper into the books he had started reading. Each day, he felt a little more at peace with who he was, a little less burdened by the judgments of others. He had learned that he didn't need anyone's approval to feel good about himself. He didn't need to prove anything to anyone. What mattered most was how he viewed himself, how he chose to show up in the world. And then one day, while out for his usual walk, the Navy SEAL ran into someone he hadn't seen in a while, an old friend from his time in the military. The man's name was Tom, and they had been stationed together on a few different missions. They had lost touch after their deployments, but the familiarity of seeing him again felt like a small piece of home. "Hey, man," Tom said, his voice full of enthusiasm. "I can't believe it's been this long. How have you been?" The Navy SEAL smiled, feeling a warmth in his chest at the sight of his old friend. "I've been good," he said. "Things have changed a lot, but I'm doing all right." They spent the next hour catching up, reminiscing about the old days and talking about everything that had happened since they last saw each other. Tom was still in the military, but he had just returned from a deployment. He talked about the challenges he had faced and the struggles of balancing work with personal life. The Navy SEAL listened intently, offering advice when he could. He was surprised at how much he had learned in the time since he left the service, how much he had grown, and how much of that growth had been shaped by the lessons he had learned outside of the military. As they parted ways, Tom clapped him on the shoulder. "You know, man," he said, "I'm proud of you. It's not easy making the transition from the military to civilian life, but you seem to have figured it out." The words hit him harder than he expected. He hadn't realized how much he needed to hear that kind of validation, especially from someone who had known him when he was still in the service. But hearing it from Tom reminded him that his journey wasn't just about overcoming the challenges he faced on his own. It was about the people who had been there with him, supporting him and watching him grow. For the first time in a long time, the Navy SEAL felt truly proud of how far he had come. He had faced adversity and he had faced it head-on. But it was the quiet moments, the self-reflection, and the connections he had made along the way that had truly shaped him. As he walked back to his apartment that evening, he thought about everything that had happened, the lessons, the challenges, and the people who had helped him along the way. It had been a journey of self-discovery, of learning to let go and of finding peace. And while he knew there would be more obstacles ahead, he also knew that he was ready for whatever came next.